Hello, everyone, and welcome to English 2105, British Literature from its beginnings to 1700. My name is Tim Wilson. I'm the professor for this course. So we've gone over the course logistics a bit. We've talked about what's going to be expected of you in terms of assignments. We've talked about the reading list. Now, before we begin studying English literature, we need to figure out, I guess, what is this beast, English literature? So defining what it is, what we can hope to get out of the study of English literature is a good point of departure before we embark on the enterprise. How to approach the great books, so not just English literature, but the great works of natural philosophy and science, so Newton, Aristotle, Galileo, religion, philosophy, these great books that stand the test of time in terms of somehow teaching us something, how to think about approaching those more generally. And then we're going to talk about a quick introduction to literary periods. I won't go into depth on what defines and what makes up those literary periods, but just some simple charts for you to start to appreciate who's where in those literary periods. Okay, so defining English literature. So first, literature, what is it? So literature literally comes from Latin, which has to do any writing with letters. So letter and literature share the same root. So literally speaking, it's anything that is written could be described as literature. So that leads to the next question, which would be then, okay, well, if that's the broadest, most literal definition of literature, there are things that we, by definition, but maybe we don't consciously articulate that definition, but we assume there's a distinction between something that's studied as literature in university or what have you, and another written document like what I have here, a car manual or a menu at Starbucks. We don't read that as literature typically. So literature we commonly think of, the first reaction might be to say, well, it's a product of the creative imagination. I'll jump to one definition that may help us, is a linguistic usage, I would say, a linguistic usage by which meaningful possibilities of a world are articulated for the first time. So I'll try to unpack that a bit. It's a bit wordy. I understand that. So, and in order to unpack that, I'll borrow from this Russian formalist Viktor Shklovsky's, who coined this term defamiliarization, in order to describe the function of literature, the process or result of rendering unfamiliar. So often the terms that we use can seem to be familiar, and we pass over them unquestioningly. The terms we use, the experiences we may be talking about, become familiar and cliche and deadened. So the function of literature or literature functions as literature when it is defamiliarizing those terms, defamiliarizing that experience that it's meant to communicate. So we can oppose that to ordinary language. So ordinary language is a communication of exchange, or an exchange of meanings and values that are preset, predetermined, pre-understood. The terms are already delineated by previous, I have here naming, a previous kind of cultural determination of what those terms mean and have accumulated over time. When I say, what time is the bus coming? At no point are you thinking, okay, is this a metaphysical question about time? Is the bus a metaphor for something? At no point are we delving into what bus means, what time means. These are, you have a very specific cue to look at your watch. Okay, so he's going to want to know the bus is going to be coming in the next few minutes or so. And by bus, he means the city bus. He's not talking about some sort of metaphorical form of transport to another realm. So another example in our everyday discourse, we might say, I have been hurt by intimate relationships in the past. So very standard. Here the terms and the ideas of the discourse are taken as pre-given. We understand what hurt means, what relationships mean. In literary discourse, on the other hand, we might say, again, using metaphor, using a different approach to language, love is a red, red rose. Its blossoms die early, but its thorns linger. So through the metaphor, which is a bringing together of two meanings, two experiences, and showing a likeness that may not have been obvious before. Okay, so here through the metaphor, an aspect of love is revealed for the first time. So before we could say that, I've been hurt by relationships in the past, but here through the metaphor, the fact that this is a rose, that the blossom, the beautiful part of the rose is organically linked to the thorns. It's part of the organism. It's part of that organic unity. So too with love. So the poet, the speaker here, is drawing out that aspect of the continuity between the pain and the beauty of love, so to speak. So one example of what we could see as defamiliarization, or a way of making us think anew in literary discourse that we wouldn't get in normal discourse. Defining English literature. So what does that mean? So English literature refers to the study of literary texts from around the world written in the English language. So there's a nuance here between British and English literature. So whereas English literature can be literature written in English from India, from the United States, from Canada, from Australia, from largely the Commonwealth countries. British literature refers to literature written in the British Isles. So it has a geographic / national boundary, and it could technically include various languages. However, this is British literature before 1700 in the English department. So the assumption here is that it's English literature, so literature written in the English language and written in the British Isles. So a national, geographical / linguistic defining feature for this course. But English generally, in terms of English literature as a discipline, will often study American works, Canadian works, etc. So works written broadly in English across the world. The study of English. So English studies as a discipline are a relatively recent phenomenon, really a product of the mid-19th century, and up until World War I, following German scholars, took a largely philological approach. So the analysis of the kind of textual roots, linguistic roots of older text, and this, well, both the approach, but also the rise of English and the study of other vernacular languages is tied to a European nationalistic thought of the 19th century. So as nations tried to define themselves in terms of their nationhood and their culture, part of defining that becomes defining, okay, what's our linguistic our unique linguistic roots? What's our unique cultural and literary heritage? So you see German studies, the study of German culture, language, literature, the study of English literature, the study of French literature, etc. Within that loose framework. The other aspect I would point to there is that, at least in the English world, so North America, Britain, largely for this aspect. The study of English was seen as a replacement for religion, which was dying. So you could have the same type of interaction with works that force one to contemplate moral problems, let us say, if you studied these English works in a highly secular age. So if the study theology is waning in its popularity, could the study of English replace that in some way? Also the classics. So yeah, also the study of the classics. So the classics, more people are joining the undergrad population, so to speak, after World War II. Many more people are studying in universities. Not everyone is able to study the classical languages. There's a certain difficulty there. There's certain class barriers to being able to study the classics. The study of the vernacular languages, including English, was seen as a replacement for that, or as a substitute for that. As a result, there were in the late 60s, early 70s, quite a peak of the study of English literature. This data is from the United States. It's a degree completion, bachelor's degree completion in English compared to all other degrees as a percentage on the right axis, to all other degrees, and on the left as a total number. So you see that both in terms of the number, but also the percentage of all degrees, it peaked in the early 70s. There's been quite a decline in terms of the especially as a percentage of all degrees since then, to below 3% from above 7% in the early 70s. And as I say here in the slide, part of the larger, what could be called crisis of the humanities. So by that we mean, okay, many of you, if you've taken the humanities, maybe your friends, maybe your parents are saying, what are you going to do with that? So what are the practical utility of the humanities is increasingly in focus, as well as a sense that let's say technological advancements have made the study of texts themselves, superfluous, what have you. So there's a number of dimensions of this, but it's say quantitatively borne out in figures such as decline in enrollments, decline in degrees as a percentage of all degrees. I will say, in terms of this is encouragement I give to people who are studying humanities and social sciences, is in terms of quantitatively speaking, in terms of earning value of someone with those degrees, a bachelor in those degrees, it's on par with the other degrees. So there's a couple of the professional degrees that will earn immediately a bit higher. So I believe, business and engineering, out of the gate, they earn a bit more and then it levels off. But then the other is all basically the same. So if you are in humanities or social sciences, that's one, despite the crisis, that's one positive takeaway. Okay, so we've talked about what is literature, what's English literature, and then so people study it, and there's a field of study. So we just talked about that briefly. And then, so why write literature? So first of all, literary traditions begin as oral traditions. So literature is written, but it begins in every instance in an oral tradition of telling stories. So in those, across every culture that does this, the reason for doing this, securing fame or honor for the hero of the story and the teller perhaps, but also it's a way in which the culture is preserving their own ancestral values, their own cultural traditions. This is important to us. This is something to pass on from generation to generation through the way we tell stories of what that that culture, what that society values. So it has that sort of importance for culture. And then maybe even more broadly, we could say that there's say a natural tendency to narrative. Okay, so so there's a field in cognitive psychology that as a theory of the definition of one's self as being defined by the narratives we tell ourselves. So there's narrative construction of identity, or narrative identity theory. So if I look at pictures of myself as a 6-year-old, or if I think about what I did when I was 6, or if I think about even 10 years ago and 20 years ago, or if I think about even last week, I somehow have to tell myself that there is a continuity there. You know, it's not necessarily a continuity in terms of material causation, in terms of continuity of thoughts, in any respect. But I have to tell myself that I did this for a certain reason. It was leading up to this, and then I put a little bow around that, and I tell myself that is an I, so to speak, across time. So the narrative theory of identity, or the coherence of the self across time, is very important aspect of that. So narrative, telling stories, important for a culture. We see in recent history of the last few thousand years, the oral traditions that we see in our own past, maybe primordially for the construction of our identity as selves, but also I point out here the adaptive functions of narrative. So those cultures, those individuals that are able to tell their stories, to preserve their values well, are able to do this well, was being able to tell these stories of how successful hunts take place, how to live together well, how to construct communities well. Is that an adaptive function that would allow a species in an evolutionary sense? So there are theorists who think this, that narratives, stories, literature have an evolutionary benefit for groups that can do them well. Okay, so there's these reasons, as I said, natural reasons for writing literature. Now, literary traditions as ways of utilizing technological means. So I've been talking about primarily oral traditions. Then literary traditions that use technology to secure those oral utterances in some sort of graphic form, use various modes of technology to secure and make even more stable over time. So if part of the advantage is securing over time from generation to generation, or with another person, securing a message, securing a value, a cultural value, and that's adaptive because it allows us as a group to take advantage of different lessons learned on optimizing behavior. Then literary traditions, ostensibly, broadly understood, are ways of making that even more secure and stable over time. So beginning with a manuscript. So a manuscript is literally handwritten, and that can be in a scroll, or it can be a codex, which is a book as you understand it that we have today. So that's our earliest obvious literary technologies. And then we have print technologies, just 500 years old, basically, that allow that to be replicated more quickly. These graphic marks can be stabilized and standardized, replicated quickly, replicated cheaply, very important. And now digital technologies, which open up different arrays for the ability to disseminate cheaply sometimes. That's a whole other discussion. But also, again, for modes of preservation, the ability to preserve quite a bit of mountains of information on a USB key. opens up again, as I say, different avenues, different technological ways of advancing that that goal. Why study literature? So why enter into the field of English literature as a field of academic study? So there's the pleasure of reading. So people, I often joke, you know, people must still be reading novels on beaches or on planes because they're still being sold at novels are still being sold at airports. So someone's reading. So there's a pleasure to reading that seems to still endure. But academic study is not identical with the reading for pleasure. So hopefully, if you are studying literature, there's still pleasure in that. But the academic study is supposed to build on that pleasure and analyze it and come to conclusions about what, let's say, the significance and the meaning of what you're reading. So why would one want to undertake this study, this academics, this path? So I would say there's basically two buckets: cultural understanding. So if we assume that an understanding of various modes of cultural expression in the past and the present, if we're telling stories about ourselves, both as individuals and as cultures, to some extent, then understanding these modes of storytelling will help us understand different cultures, different individuals in different walks of life. And certainly there is data to corroborate that people with those backgrounds do well in the labor market, are able to contribute to organizations in a lot of different ways. Critical thinking and writing skills, and I talked about that when I talked about the objectives of the course. So hopefully, again, those are things that employers are always looking for. So we've talked about what is literature. We've talked a bit about what the discipline is, about the discipline's roots. We've talked about, you know, why literature is written, then why it gets studied, and now let's say maybe peek into the crystal ball in terms of where the academic study of literature may be going in the future. I would say the couple of the biggest trends are here in terms of interdisciplinarity is increasingly important, as well as computational methods and digital technologies. So just to unpack that a little bit. So literary study is blending increasingly across other fields in the humanities and social sciences. And this is not necessarily that new. It's been happening for a couple of decades. But cultural studies, women's studies, gender studies, critical race studies. So that's been happening for a while, and it's primarily across the social sciences and humanities. So you get these cross-disciplinary studies that see, you know, literature is one field, but maybe also the economics of the situation with women in a particular culture, but coupled also with politics, with history, what have you. Now, but there's also increasingly even broader kind of nexus of disciplines coming together with the STEM fields, so science, technology, engineering, and math, as well as health. So we have certain areas of literary studies, so evolutionary literary theory, which tries to take some of the things I was talking about, the adaptive functions of literature is one aspect they explore. Neurohumanities, which exciting field, which takes insights of neuroscience and the methods of neuroscience. So analyzing brain activity through different methods, and how that brain activity is effective when one is exposed to different types of literary works or cultural works. Eco-criticism, health humanities, I won't go into those. Also, as I mentioned, computational methods, digital technology is huge. So this is already making big waves. The digital humanities departments popping up everywhere. So there, the point of departure is one of, let's say, well, as I say here, distant reading versus close reading. So primarily, what we're going to approach and what literary tradition has always approached as the primary method for reading a text is called close reading. So, and And this is never going to go, in order to understand your work, we have to read it closely, and we have to approach that work as such. However, with the digitized texts at our disposal now, and our ability to take that as a textual field, as a data field, and methods of finding patterns within those fields, an approach that has been called by Franco Moretti distant reading is really the approach of these digital technologies now. So rather, in one's lifetime, I can probably closely read, a few hundred books, maybe 1,000 if I'm lucky, but it wouldn't be that closely. But if I take all of Google's digitized texts and I'm able to run various algorithms across that field, I'm able to find patterns across tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of texts. Call into question traditional periodizations. Periodizations, is there a sharp break at this point between Romantic literature and the neoclassical literature before that, or do we see something else happening before if we look at the patterns across a broad field? The other thing would be the computational methods. So the digital technologies are enabling a certain approach of data analytical approach. Computational methods means you don't necessarily need the kind of the digital infrastructure to undertake this. It could be almost with paper and pen, taking a quantitative or statistical approach to analyzing, let's say, relationships or speech patterns in a play, and making a case in that way, as opposed again to the traditional method of English literary study, or any of the humanities for that matter, which has been qualitative arguments, really. So I welcome these changes, actually. So interdisciplinarity, I think these, if done well, can help our disciplines. Computational methods certainly can help, okay? So I think there's a real aversion in humanities departments to quantitative approaches, and I think an aversion that needs to be shaken. I think it needs to be embraced as one other set of evidence to be marshaled to advance our, let's say, conclusion about a set of texts that we may be analyzing. Here, how to approach the great books. I'm going to go quickly through this. This is it's less about the course. It's about, so I've talked about, let's say, the academic study of literature. I've talked about, why do people, what do people hope to attain from an English literature degree or from our course, and how to approach literature from an academic perspective. But this section is not going to be on the final exam, and I'm not expecting anything that. This is more for the exam of life, so to speak. Beyond the course are great books, beyond reading for pleasure, beyond reading for, I got to know this for the final exam. Do we see them as somehow manifesting beauty, or somehow making me think about truth, or making me want to be a better person? So those, and again, I'll go over this section quickly, but that, I think, so rather than the academic study, rather than for pleasure, do we see it as having an educational value for the soul? And again, this is not for the final, this is for the rest of your life. So I would say for myself, one way I try to think about that is is there an enduring object of aesthetic perception there? The enduring object of philosophic or scientific questioning, truth, goodness, the enduring object of spiritual or moral education? Are those enduring objects, the truth, beauty, the good, are those somehow made manifest, or am I somehow brought to question those? So if I'm looking at the beauty of a work, its poetics, its language, it's the quality of the verse, the metaphor, the epic, an epic simile, and we'll talk about those. Does that stand out for me in the work? The structure, is there kind of a beautiful organic structure to the work? And we'll see some of the ways in which For instance, Antony and Cleopatra, Paradise Lost, sonnets, or structure. Genre, does the work innovatively define the genre? Truth does the work make me question and think about the cosmos, the beings as a whole, in a new way? The community, does it make me think about the way in which the self relates to the community in a new way? Does it make me think about myself in a new way, and how I question myself and maybe the limits of myself? And finally, does it lead to goodness? And this is probably the toughest one to articulate. Here's three possible questions you can ask yourself. But does the work, whether it's, again, work of fine art, the Mona Lisa, we're looking at that, or whether it's reading Hamlet, does it in some way lead you to realize kind of the spiritual and moral values of gratitude, and seeing kind of a certain humility and gratitude in the face of the mystery of existence, purpose, seeing or questioning at least to what extent one's life is purposeful and finally has meaning. What if it doesn't lead you to think about that, is it the problem with the work, or how we approach it? So finally, English literary periods. So a quick introduction to these, that if you take this course, but also the sister course 2106, you'll be going through these literary periods. Okay, so here's my, this thing's always in the way here, I'll just put that over here. English literary periods and the history of ideas. So I like to be able to schematize things and try to summarize them with a chart. And so here's what I've tried to do as a way of kind of at a glance, the English literary periods that you're broadly going to hear about, both in the blue shades is for this course. So we're broadly looking at the medieval period and the Renaissance period. And then in the green shading, if you take the sister course 2106, which is British literature 1700 to the present, then you will be looking at those broad periods. So Restoration, 18th century, you'll be looking at Romanticism, Victorian literature, the 20th century and beyond. And then each of those periods can have sub-periods, as we'll see, okay? There's some indicative authors there. So in terms of on the right, on the far left, we have ancient or pre-English roots. So before we even had English literature, before that, there were old Greek, Latin texts that written by authors such as those listed. And in the medieval period, we have the Dream of the Rude poet, as we see. We have Beowulf. So we won't be studying Beowulf, but it's a landmark work in Old English literature. Since we're going through this course at an accelerated pace, as it's a summer course, I didn't want you to be bogged down with the reading of that, but I do encourage you to read it. It's a landmark of the tradition. So Chaucer, kind of the one who stands out in that period, in English literature at least. And then the Renaissance, as you can see, Sir Thomas More, Sir Philip Sidney, who will read, Edmund Spenser, who will read, Shakespeare, who will read, Milton, who will read, and then for the other periods, 18th century, Pope, Swift, Romanticism, Blake, Wordsworth. So maybe names you've heard of, and we'll get to know better when you take those courses. In the Victorian period, Tennyson, Carlyle, George Eliot. In the 20th century, the early 20th century, Yeats, T.S. Eliot, a real kind of giant of modernism, Virginia Woolf, excellent prose writer. And then latter half of the 20th century, Salman Rushdie, Julian Barnes, Peter Ackroyd. They're more diverse. The canon is yet really to be established there. I think that's kind of part of the problem of canon formation. It takes time, and if we're too close to it, it hasn't, let's say, withstood the test of time, so to speak. I also have not necessary to know, but we may make passing reference to some of these figures in the history of ideas. So within the classical tradition, which includes ancient and medieval, Plato, Aristotle, Cicero, St. Augustine, Aquinas. So there, you know, these are the ideas around at the time. It's good to kind of keep that in mind. And then for the modern age, so the last 500 years, I've divided those in three waves, following the suggestion, the method of a political philosopher, Leo Strauss, who's defined these three waves. I won't go into those waves, but and we won't be expected to be masters of any of those philosophers or those thinkers. But as we talk about the shift to the Renaissance, we'll want to keep in mind to some extent their place in relation to that first wave of modernity. Now, here's a more detailed view. Again, I won't go through this, but it's a more detailed view of some of the sub periods of the period we'll be covering. So the medieval period will be beginning on the Thursday lecture. We'll be beginning by looking at Old English literature, which is in that Anglo-Saxon period. There's a period after that, which we won't really be studying. We'll mention it, but the Anglo-Norman period and Middle English proper, 1200 to 1485. 1485 in England is usually the date assigned for the beginning of the Renaissance. It's when the Tudor dynasty, after the Battle of Bosworth Fields, and ended up taking over the rule of England. It's close to the time of the invention of, or the bringing of the printing press to England with Caxton's press. And you see, as I mentioned, the Elizabethan and Jacobean age as a golden age of English literature. Now, I've also just, again, as a way of trying to provide some sort of historical perspective. So if we think of perspective as we see something in the horizon and we see that this is more distant than this, and this is closer to me, and this is a bit further away. Often, without thinking about the historical perspective, people could approach something like Paradise Lost or Shakespeare's plays and see them as equally just in the past, as a long time ago, the same as Beowulf, the same as the period of the Romans, what have you. So I do like timelines for that purpose. Again, a quantitative approach that doesn't often happen with humanists, but the way of seeing, for instance, that the present at the far right, our distance from Paradise Lost or the Elizabethan sonnets, we are closer to it than the Elizabethan sonnets is to the Wanderer, for instance, or we're closer to the Canterbury Tales than the Canterbury Tales is to the Dream of the Rubes, so for instance. Not to mention how far the Wanderer is from the Roman Republic, etc. So a little bit of historical perspective, and that's it for the introduction. I hope that was useful for those of you whose audio cut out when we did it on Tuesday. As I mentioned, I'll continue to record these and post them on YouTube and future lectures. So looking forward to the next lecture on Old English literature. Thank you.